It began with a clock. 48 hours. A countdown carved into the conscience of two nations. In the heart of Kingston, Jamaica, the Parliament stood restless. Inside, the air trembled with anger. Outside, thunder rolled across the Caribbean sky. Prime Minister Andrew Holness had just issued a command, not a request, not a warning, but an ultimatum. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso must apologize publicly within 48 hours or face serious diplomatic consequences. 2 days. That was all the time given for a man who had spoken one simple, dangerous truth. And across the ocean, in the red dust of West Africa, that truth refused to bow. Traoré's speech had not been polite. It had not followed the script of diplomacy. He stood before Jamaica's leaders and said words that pierced like scripture. Leadership is not a throne. It is a responsibility to the people. Those words burned through the marble walls of Parliament and landed in the streets, in radios, in hearts long tired of waiting. And when Holness demanded an apology, Traoré answered with silence, the kind of silence that shakes empires. Because sometimes the truth does not whisper, it shouts. And when it shouts, the powerful tremble. This story is not just about two men. It is about the moment when truth challenged fear, when the voice of one soldier echoed louder than a government, and when a Caribbean island learned that the words of a stranger could ignite its soul. 48 hours. That's all it took for a speech to become a storm that no one, not even the proudest kings of men, could control. Stay with me, because this is the story of what happens when truth speaks and power dares to silence it. It happened on a humid afternoon in Kingston. The hall was filled with cameras, officials, and journalists expecting polite words of diplomacy, a ceremony of smiles and empty promises. But when President Ibrahim Traoré took the stage, the air changed. He didn't stand like a guest. He stood like a witness. His eyes were steady, his tone unyielding, and his message came not from politics, but from conscience. Jamaica cannot afford to turn corruption into its operating system, he said. Leadership is not ownership, it is service. When power feeds on the people instead of serving them, it becomes a sin against God. For a brief moment, the room froze. No one moved. The silence was heavier than the Caribbean heat. Then chairs scraped, faces tightened. Some ministers whispered angrily. Others stood and walked out. Traoré did not pause. He spoke of the decay that grows when greed wears a suit. He spoke of the hospitals falling apart while money slept in foreign banks. He spoke of the children left without teachers because the funds meant for schools had vanished through invisible hands. He spoke of how nations lose their souls when their leaders trade truth for comfort. His words carried no diplomacy, no disguise. They carried judgment. Within hours, newsrooms erupted. Jamaican headlines screamed, "Foreign president insults our nation." Government officials called the speech disrespectful and undiplomatic. Yet something unusual began to happen. Outside the marble walls, people began to share his words, not in anger, but in recognition. Taxi drivers played the clips on their radios. Vendors repeated his lines in the markets. Young people uploaded the speech to social media, writing, "He just said what we've been too afraid to say." The spark had jumped from podium to pavement, from one man's courage to an entire nation's conscience. The government moved quickly to seize control of the story. Prime Minister Andrew Holness appeared on television, his expression stern, his words sharp. "No foreign leader has the right to insult our democracy or our parliament. President Traoré must apologize within 48 hours or face consequences." The countdown began. The ultimatum was meant to restore control, to remind the people who held power. But power built on fear cannot contain truth once it escapes. In the streets, the whispers grew louder. Activists who had spent years fighting corruption and being ignored suddenly found themselves on national radio. Students organized debates on integrity and justice. Pastors quoted Traoré in their Sunday sermons, calling his message a reminder that righteousness must never bow to political comfort. "The voice of truth," one pastor said, "often comes from outside the temple." While the political class fumed, the people began to see something divine in the defiance. They saw a man who spoke with no benefit to gain, no interest to protect, only conviction. Some called him reckless, others called him chosen, but everyone agreed on one thing. He spoke like a man unafraid of consequence. And in that fearlessness, people found reflection, even redemption. As the sun set over Kingston, the countdown ticked on. The government waited for an apology, the public waited for justice, and the world waited for a response. In Ouagadougou, Traoré gathered his advisors. They told him the stakes were high, but he already knew. He looked at the statement drafted by his diplomats, folded it quietly, and said, "I will not apologize for telling the truth. God's truth does not need permission." The next morning, he stepped in front of cameras. His message was brief and calm. "The truth does not bow to deadlines." With those words, the 48-hour ultimatum shattered. Across continents, the phrase spread like fire. Commentators called it defiance. Believers called it faith. Some said it was a diplomatic failure. Others said it was the first honest act of global leadership they had seen in years. In Kingston, shock turned to silence. Then silence turned to anger. Ministers called emergency meetings. Newspapers demanded sanctions. But outside, in the sun and dust, people smiled. For the first time in a long time, someone had said aloud what they whispered in private. "The truth does not bow," they repeated, as if it were a prayer. That night, graffiti appeared on walls across the city. No apology, no retreat. And so, what began as a single speech had become a sermon spreading across the islands, echoing through radios and church halls, reaching hearts that had been waiting for someone, anyone, to remind them that truth, like God, cannot be threatened, cannot be timed, and cannot be silenced. By the third day, Jamaica was a nation divided. Inside the parliament, ministers shouted about sovereignty and national pride. Outside, the streets sang with a different rhythm, a rhythm of awakening. Crowds gathered in Halfway Tree Square, in Montego Bay, in Spanish Town. The people were not holding flags or burning effigies. They held signs that read, "Apology? Number. Accountability? Yes." For the first time in years, the anger of the people was not about party or politics. It was about truth. Prime Minister Holness had intended to remind the world of Jamaica's dignity, but what his ultimatum had done was remind his own people of their frustration. Corruption, broken hospitals, missing funds, promises that never reached the poor. All of it came flooding back to the national conversation. The very words meant to silence Traoré had amplified the voices of the people. Journalists began revisiting old cases of embezzlement. Leaked documents circulated online, naming officials connected to offshore accounts. Talk shows buzzed with debates. "He didn't insult Jamaica," one radio host said. "He described it." At first, the government tried to control the wave. State media released statements accusing Traoré of seeking attention, of using Jamaica to boost his global profile. But the more they spoke, the more people tuned out. The official narrative no longer carried authority. In homes, cafes, and church halls, citizens asked each other the same question. Why did it take a man from Africa to speak the truth we already knew? The question itself became a quiet revolution. On the final morning of the ultimatum, Kingston was tense. Security forces filled the streets. News crews surrounded the Parliament. Holness was scheduled to speak at noon. At 11:59, he appeared on national television, his jaw clenched, his voice hard. "Jamaica," he said, "is not a playground for foreign politicians. Our sovereignty is sacred. President Traoré has until midnight to retract his words or face diplomatic consequences." He paused, expecting applause, but in the silence that followed, even his eyes betrayed fatigue. The room behind him seemed hollow, stripped of confidence. And across the ocean, Ibrahim Traoré walked toward a podium in Ouagadougou. There were no flags behind him, no loud declarations, no handlers rushing around. Only a man and a microphone. Cameras clicked. The world watched. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost soft. "I did not insult the Jamaican people," he said. "I spoke for them. I spoke for every citizen who has been betrayed by the greed of those who were meant to protect them. If telling the truth has become a crime, then the world is in trouble. I will not apologize for standing with the people." The words landed like thunder. Within minutes, international headlines exploded. Traoré defies Jamaica. Truth versus power, the 48-hour showdown. But beyond the headlines, something deeper was stirring. Across Kingston, church bells rang for noon prayer. Pastors invoked the story of Daniel facing the lions, of David standing before Goliath. "When truth stands before power," one preacher said, "it never stands alone. God stands with it." The crowd outside the Parliament grew larger. Police lines held steady, but the chants grew louder. "We are Jamaica! We are the truth!" they shouted. There was no violence, only conviction. An elderly woman lifted her voice, trembling but firm. "I don't know that man from Africa, but I know he spoke for us. They call it disrespect. I call it deliverance." Her words spread through social media like scripture. By evening, she became a symbol, a grandmother of the movement, a reminder that faith can still move nations. As the sun set on the 48th hour, Holness's government met in emergency session. Advisors argued. Diplomats pleaded for restraint. "Every hour we push," one aide warned, "we make him stronger." But Holness could not retreat. Pride, once chosen, rarely surrenders, and so he doubled down. "This government will not be lectured by outsiders," he declared. "Not today, not ever." But even as he spoke, the chants from outside reached the windows of Parliament. The sound was steady, unbroken, unafraid. That night, the ultimatum expired. No apology came, no retraction, no surrender. The government released a brief statement condemning Traoré's continued disrespect, but by then, the story had already left their hands. The streets had claimed it. Across Jamaica, lights burned late into the night as citizens shared clips, debated, prayed, and sang. In the darkness, a phrase spread quietly from mouth to mouth. "The truth does not bow to deadlines." By midnight, the ultimatum was dead, but a movement had been born. What began as defiance had become deliverance. For the first time in years, a weary nation was beginning to believe that truth, no matter where it comes from, is still holy. The 48 hours had ended, but Jamaica had not returned to calm. The ultimatum that was meant to silence one man had instead awakened an entire nation. Streets once quiet were now alive with song and protest. There were no slogans of hate, no cries for war, only chants of truth, painted on cardboard and carried by hands that trembled not with anger, but with conviction. No apology, no retreat. The truth stands. Across Kingston, churches opened their doors for night vigils. People lit candles, prayed for their leaders, and read aloud from the book of Isaiah. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees. For many Jamaicans, the confrontation was no longer about diplomacy or pride. It had become a spiritual reckoning. They felt that God himself had used a foreign voice to call their nation to account. In Parliament, however, fear had taken root. Ministers spoke in hushed tones about the growing crowds. Intelligence briefings warned that public anger was spreading faster than expected. Some demanded harsher responses. Others, more cautious, whispered that the president's words were not entirely false. He said what people have been saying for years, one official admitted privately. We just never thought we'd hear it said aloud. Meanwhile, the media, once cautious and compliant, found new courage. Independent journalists began reopening long-forgotten corruption cases. Reports surfaced about missing development funds, inflated contracts, and ghost companies tied to government allies. Radio hosts who once feared offending advertisers began asking dangerous questions on air. If the truth came from a foreigner, what does that say about our own silence? One of them asked. The question cut through the country like a blade. The pressure on the government grew heavier. In the markets of Kingston, women refused to sell to officials known for corruption. University students organized debates on moral leadership. Taxi drivers refused to play government propaganda on their radios. Civil society groups called for transparency laws and independent investigations. The political class tried to label these movements as foreign-inspired, but the people were no longer listening. And then came the leak. A secret recording from a closed-door parliamentary meeting found its way to the public. In it, a frustrated minister shouted, "Every time we attack him, we make him stronger." Another voice replied, bitter and afraid, "Then what? Let him humiliate us in front of the world?" The recording confirmed what the people already suspected. Their leaders were no longer united. They were panicking. As the protests spread, something unexpected began to happen. The movement remained peaceful. No looting, no violence, no fires. Instead, there were songs, old hymns of freedom rewritten with new words. In Montego Bay, choirs sang, "Truth has no borders, justice has no flag." In Spanish Town, children painted murals of Traoré beside Jamaica's national heroes, under the words, "A voice for the voiceless." What had started as a diplomatic standoff had become a moral revival. Religious leaders played a powerful role in shaping the message. In one church in downtown Kingston, a pastor stood before a crowd of hundreds and said, "God raises messengers from where we least expect them." Jonah came from the sea. Moses came from exile. And now a soldier from Africa speaks a truth we needed to hear. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping and crying. It was no longer politics. It was prophecy. But prophecy has consequences. Businesses began to lose confidence. Investors hesitated. The Jamaican dollar wavered. International partners expressed concern over instability. The government blamed Traoré for stirring unrest, yet every attempt to redirect anger back toward him only deepened the resentment against them. "You can't blame the messenger," one teacher said on live TV. "Blame the mirror you broke when you saw your reflection." By the end of the week, the ruling party's approval ratings had fallen sharply. The opposition seized the moment, calling for reforms and early elections. In a rare move, the Speaker of Parliament announced a bipartisan committee to investigate public spending. For the first time in decades, accountability was on the floor, not as a slogan, but as a demand. Still, the government resisted. Holness addressed the nation again, saying, "Jamaica will not be ruled by chaos or foreign interference." His words sounded strong, but his tone betrayed fatigue. Outside, the people were no longer listening. Their faith was no longer in politicians. It was in truth itself, something older, something divine. By Sunday, thousands filled Emancipation Park for a massive prayer rally. The sky was overcast, but the voices were clear. "Truth is from God," they chanted, "and God does not bow." In that moment, the line between politics and prophecy blurred completely. Reporters described it as a movement unlike any Jamaica had ever seen, peaceful, prayerful, and unstoppable. And far away in Burkina Faso, Traoré watched the images in silence. He did not speak. He simply bowed his head. Perhaps he knew that what had begun as his battle was no longer his. It belonged to the people now, to their courage, their faith, and their awakening. The ultimatum was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The ground beneath the halls of power had shifted, and no decree, no headline, no speech could turn it back. The world had been watching. What began as a diplomatic quarrel between Jamaica and Burkina Faso had now become a symbol, a headline that refused to fade. Across the Atlantic, news anchors in Washington and London debated whether Traoré's defiance was courage or recklessness. Pundits on American talk shows called it the most unexpected collision between faith and power in modern diplomacy. Others warned that this kind of populist truth-telling could set a precedent that frightened world leaders everywhere. In Africa, the reaction was electric. Traoré's image appeared on murals from Dakar to Nairobi, painted beside words that read, "Truth has no apology." Young Africans celebrated him as the voice of a generation tired of corruption and manipulation from both local and foreign powers. "He spoke to us all," one Senegalese activist said. When he said, "The truth does not bow to deadlines," it wasn't just about Jamaica. It was about every leader who hides from the light. But in the West, the tone was mixed. American policymakers watched with unease. To them, the situation represented more than just a Caribbean-African standoff. It symbolized a shift in the global moral conversation. Here was a leader from one of the world's poorest nations challenging the system of polite silence that had long defined international diplomacy. It was unsettling. One columnist for the Washington Post wrote, "Traoré is forcing the world to remember that truth is not a strategy, it's a calling." In Europe, opinions were divided. Some diplomats accused him of grandstanding. Others quietly admired his conviction. French and British media recalled the history of colonialism that bound Africa and the Caribbean in a shared story of exploitation and endurance. Perhaps, one British historian noted, this is not a clash between nations but between eras, the old world of control and the new world of conscience. Even within the United States, the story resonated differently. Church groups across the South held prayer gatherings for both nations. In sermons, pastors drew parallels between Traoré's stand and the biblical prophets who spoke truth to kings. When a man refuses to apologize for telling the truth, one preacher in Alabama said, he joins the ranks of those who walk with God, not with men. Meanwhile, political analysts couldn't ignore the deeper question rising beneath the headlines. Was this the beginning of a new moral movement in world politics? Commentators called it the age of unapologetic truth. From Africa to the Caribbean, citizens were rising, demanding integrity, and rejecting leaders who cloaked injustice in ceremony. And yet, in the power circles of Washington, there was discomfort. For decades, America had positioned itself as the global defender of democracy and truth. But this new movement, rooted in faith, humility, and moral rebellion, did not come from Washington or Brussels. It came from Ouagadougou, from a man with no superpower behind him, only conviction. A former U.S. diplomat summarized it best. Traoré reminded the world that truth doesn't need permission from power. It only needs a voice. And once that voice is heard, it can't be silenced. Not by governments, not by deadlines, not even by fear. By the time the week ended, the story had grown beyond borders. What was once an ultimatum between two leaders had become a mirror held up to every government, every people, and every heart that had forgotten that justice, too, has a divine author. The 48-hour ultimatum has long expired, but its echoes still drift through the Caribbean air like a stubborn hymn. The headlines have faded, the cameras have moved on. Yet something in Jamaica has changed forever. The nation did not receive an apology. It received an awakening. What began as a foreign speech became a mirror, forcing Jamaicans, and perhaps the entire world, to confront a question older than politics itself. What is a nation without truth? When did fear become more sacred than faith? In the months that followed, the tremors continued. Parliament promised reforms. Anti-corruption laws were grafted but delayed. Old politicians tried to reclaim their credibility, speaking of transparency and reconciliation. But on the streets, the people had already found their own vocabulary. They spoke not of policies, but of principles. They talked about service, dignity, and accountability. At every rally, every vigil, one phrase remained on their lips. The truth does not bow to deadlines. It was written on banners, sung in churches, whispered in prayers. To many, it had become a kind of scripture, a reminder that God's justice is not bound by clocks or borders. Truth comes when it is needed, not when it is convenient. And far away in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré went on leading his nation, quietly but resolutely. He never glorified what had happened in Jamaica. He simply said, "When truth travels, it does not belong to the speaker. It belongs to the hearts that receive it." Those words resonated across continents because deep down, people recognized something divine in them. Today, political analysts still argue whether he was right or reckless. But beyond the arguments, one fact remains. Jamaica, like so many nations before it, rediscovered its conscience through conflict. The ultimatum meant to silence one voice became the trumpet of many. And now the question lingers, not just for Jamaica or Africa, but for every land that prays to God and claims to love justice. What will we do when the truth comes for us? Will we hide behind politics and pride? Or will we stand, as one man once did, and say without fear, "I will not apologize for standing with the people"? History will remember those 48 hours not as a diplomatic failure, but as a divine interruption. A moment when heaven spoke through the courage of a single man, and the world was forced to listen. Because deadlines fade, governments fall, and power passes away. But truth, God's truth, endures forever. If you believe that, then carry it forward. Tell it to your children. Teach it in your churches. Whisper it in your prayers. For nations may tremble, but the truth will never bow.